An important topic in Pillars is that of communication. Now, when we think about communication, especially in ministry as leaders, oftentimes we think about preaching a sermon or giving a teaching or communicating on a podcast in some ways. But communication and its influence has to be seen in a much broader way. For example, one of the most important ways you will have influence on people and on your team is how you communicate in a meeting when you gather together to meet about the work that you are doing together. Jesus had a lot of these meetings. The gospel records how he would sit down with the disciples, sometimes in different situations, sometimes with different numbers of them, never always the 12, sometimes the 3, and he would meet with them. He was communicating to them by how he ran that meeting. And in this session, we want to learn practically, how do you lead an effective meeting so that you are communicating what needs to be communicated so your team can carry out the work in the right spirit and in the right way that's there. When you are leading a meeting, when you are communicating to a meeting, it doesn't actually begin in the meeting. It starts before the meeting. There are actually 3 stages to when you lead a meeting. The first stage is what you do before the meeting. The second stage is the meeting itself. And then the third stage is what you do after the meeting. Every time you lead a meeting, every time you are communicating in that way, you have to be thinking about all 3 stages. So let's look at each stage and understand what is our function as leaders in communicating in each of these stages. First, you have the setup stage, all that you do to communicate before you've even met together. There are certain questions you need to ask that will guide your setting up of the meeting for most success. If you don't ask and answer these questions, I can almost guarantee you that the communication in the meeting will be really far less effective and cluttered and not clear. The first question is this: why are you having the meeting? You have to define the purpose of the meeting. And it's important to do that because if you don't have a purpose to the meeting, then the people who are in the meeting will come up with their own definitions, and communication then gets unclear because everybody has a different agenda as to why they're meeting together. So you have to be clear, this is the purpose of the meeting. And practically speaking, most meetings are most effectively communicated when they only have 1 or 2 purposes. You are better off having more meetings that are shorter with 1 purpose than 1 long meeting that has 12 different purposes in it. People lose track. People get tired. It's just too many words. So in your setup for the meeting, you ask the question, what is the purpose of this meeting? So there is clarity going into the meeting and communication is going to be more effective. The second question you have to ask in the setup is then, well, who should be at this meeting? If this is the purpose, that then defines who should be present at the meeting. Oftentimes in ministries, I find that everybody goes to every meeting. And when you have the wrong people sitting around the table in a meeting, it will destroy communication. They may not have the understanding, they may not have the perspective or the experience. So you have to ask this second question: who should be at this meeting because of its purpose? And as a leader, you have to create a culture in your team that if somebody is not invited to a meeting, they do not feel slighted by it. They're not offended by it. They understand there are meetings that have specific purposes, and the people who contribute to that purpose will be at that meeting. Then there's a third question you have to ask. When should the meeting be held? Now, this may seem like a trivial question, but it is really important. Timing matters. If there's a big program and there's a lot of energy that's dispersed in this program and it's a huge success and there's a lot of emotion, to have a meeting right after it is probably not going to be the best time because people's views are skewed. If it's horrifically not successful, they have a bias that way. If it's greatly successful, they have a bias that way. You have to plan out based upon the purpose and the people, when is the best time to have this meeting so they can come to it ready and prepared for what's going to happen. The timing of the meeting really matters. You hold a meeting late at night, people may be very tired. Hold a meeting on a Sunday morning in between services, people will be distracted. Be careful, as Jesus was, in selecting when you hold this meeting. Then there's a fourth question. Where should we hold it? Now that may seem even more trivial, but there's an example in the scriptures where Jesus sent the disciples out, they did work, they come back, and he's going to meet with them about their work, kind of debrief it. He literally takes them to another village. He removes them from their place of ministry so they're in a place more isolated where he can have an effective meeting with them. Where should the meeting be held? Sometimes meetings are far better held in a coffee shop than they are in a boardroom. Sometimes meetings are better held going for a walk. Sometimes meetings are better held in a place where there is a whiteboard. You have to land on this because not just timing matters, space matters. You see, these questions in the setup, they're really preparing you for all that needs to be accomplished in the most effective communication. The fifth and most important question is what work should be done by the people coming to the meeting in preparation for the meeting. You see, what happens a lot of times in ministry is we have a meeting, we schedule the meeting, and everybody comes to the meeting to work. They don't do anything before the meeting. The purpose of the meeting is to work. I want to encourage you to change that strategy. Have people do the work before the meeting, so when they come to the meeting, they are there to share their work. And in sharing their work, there's a much greater communication and a more effective means of communication that can go on, which means you have to set them up before the meeting. So you may say, next Tuesday, we're going to have a meeting. I want you to come prepared to answer these 3 questions. Now those team members are thinking about those questions. They're studying those questions. They're praying about those questions. They come ready to work. All of this is the setup for the meeting. Sometimes the work they do, you actually want them to give it to you before the meeting so you can understand, here's how they're thinking, here's where they're at, and I can better work with them when we are together. The setup, the first stage, it's significantly important. Once it becomes a routine in your leadership habit, it's actually much easier than it sounds. But if you're not spending the energy focusing on the setup, I encourage you to do that and ask yourselves these questions. Why are we meeting? Who should be meeting? When and where should the meeting be taking place? And what do I give them to work on? So when we come to the meeting, we're sharing our work and there's going to be a much greater communication that goes on. Once you're done with the setup, then you move into the second stage, which is the meeting itself. Now, when you think about the meeting, let's say it's an hour long, I want you to think about maybe 4 stages that exist in this meeting. The first stage is just how you start out that meeting. And when you start out that meeting, it's important that you kind of prepare people for why they're there. It doesn't have to be long or complicated, but what you are telling them is, here's why this meeting is taking place. Kind of, here's how we got here. Here's why we are meeting. And you give a little history that brings them up to this point. Because people will communicate and learn most effectively if that meeting is connected to the story that brings them up there. That only takes a minute or 2 for people to understand the why we're here and what we're doing. Then it's very important before you even jump into the meeting that you explain the purpose of the meeting. What is its goal? And what's the process that's going to be going on? So in the next hour, our goal is to design this, and we're going to do it in 3 ways. Whatever it may be, you want to tell them before the meeting actually engages, so they have a clear expectation of what the process of the meeting is. Remember, they're going to participate in that meeting, so you're painting it for them. You're kind of setting it up. Then you get into kind of the major area of the meeting. You're going to end by concluding the meeting, and when you conclude the meeting, you'll summarize what was achieved in process. But it's that major area I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about. Because as a leader, leading a team, when you grab a meeting together, you've set them up, they've come in, you've kind of introduced the meeting, and now you're actually going to go into the meeting. There are 3 options that are available for you as a leader. 3 different strategies of communication. All 3 are legitimate. One is command, one is collaborate, and one is consensus. And that will determine how you communicate in that meeting. Command is when you stand up in the meeting and you speak. You have an authority, you have a conviction, and you speak. And people listen, and they listen well. and that's healthy, and that's right. Then there is collaboration. Collaboration is when you work together as a team. It's as if command is you are speaking what God's truth is, and collaboration, the team is designing what God's truth is, what God's plan is. Then there is consensus. Consensus is a bit different from the other two, because consensus is when you have an idea and you are leading with that idea, you just want their feedback. Now you'll notice the difference between the three. Command, I stand up and I give instruction. Collaboration, I lead the group working together to land on the instruction. Consensus, I stand up, I have some instruction, but I want their feedback in giving that instruction. My encouragement to you is when you are leading a meeting based upon why that meeting is happening, what the goal of that meeting is, and who is there, pick one of the three. It's very hard to do all three in the same meeting. What does the meeting require of you as a leader? A lot of people would automatically always say, oh, it should always be collaboration. But that's not necessarily true. There are times when your team just needs clear direction from you, and they will be grateful for that. But it can't always just be command. There are times when you work together, collaborate. And then this third one, consensus, becomes very important too, because it's as if you have a sense, but you want their speaking into it. And these three distinct ways that you can communicate and lead a meeting will really help you be able to achieve your outcome in that. You go into a meeting and you know, I'm going to stand up and really give direction. I'm going to elicit their response to some direction that I want to give. Or you know what? I'm not giving any direction, and together we're going to come up with a plan. Have it in your mind. You've done the setup. You've answered those questions. You now have that gathering. You have the meeting. You've prepared them for that meeting. They know why they're there, and you have picked which choice you're going to do for command, to collaborate, to consensus. And then at the end of the meeting, when that's done, you kind of summarize that meeting, and everybody goes away from a really good meeting. Most people don't like meetings, but they don't like meetings because they're long or boring or cluttered. Put somebody in a really good, effective meeting that helps them be better at their job. They will be happy to be in that kind of a meeting. And we think, well, then we're done now. But there is a third stage. The first stage is the setup. The second stage is the meeting itself. But then you have a third stage, which is the follow-up that has to go on after the meeting. In ministry, there are often many meetings, and there are many projects, and there are many programs, and there's a variety of activities going on. And the follow-up stage becomes incredibly important for you to be able to revisit to them after the meeting's done what they may have forgotten. In this follow-up stage, usually done by some form of communication, it can be an email, it can be a WhatsApp group, it can be a text, but it's a way of following up with them without having to gather again. And what you are doing in that follow-up is you are basically summarizing really succinctly what the meeting was, maybe using some different words, but you're giving them kind of a, here's what happened when we met, and you give them the actionable items that come out of that. And then in that follow-up, what becomes very important is you invite them to respond. If they didn't see it that way, if their conclusion was different, if the action they thought they were supposed to take is different than the action you have told them they're taking, you invite them to respond. You've got these three stages. You've started with the setup. So there's clarity, and there's effectiveness, and there's intentionality. And the right people are around the table, and they're all prepared for the meeting. And then you have the meeting itself, and it's in the right place at the right time. And you've decided based upon the agenda and the purpose, which one of the three roles you're going to take on as the meeting leader. And then you summarize what happens in that meeting. And then you have the follow-up when you send out an email or a text that simply summarizes the meeting again with the actionable item, but invites their response so that more clarity can happen. When you use this model and you lead meetings, you will find that there is incredible effective communication. People will have clear ideas, clear understanding. If there were questions, these will be answered. everybody gets unified and aligned for the same goal and the same purpose, some of the most effective communication that you can deliver is not from a platform or a podcast. It's around a table with your team. And some of the most confusing communication that you can deliver will be around that same table if you haven't prepared well to lead a meeting. We become very busy with our work, and we treat meetings far too trivially, far too quickly, far too randomly. Jesus had a high level of intentionality when he met with the disciples. Who he met with, why he met with them, even where he met with them. We need to have that same level of intentionality when we meet with our teams so that the most effective communication can be carried out in meetings that will be a part of our every week of ministry.